Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
His ruse was that he'd claim he was celebrating a big lottery win or a casino windfall or a win on the horses. Then out would come the champagne, a friendly offer of a drink to share the celebration, and sometimes he'd stop the cab and get into the back with them. But the champagne he gave them was laced with strong sedatives, like temazepam. His victims would black out and wake up to discover they'd been sexually assaulted.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
True Criminals Insiders.
If you're following us on Patreon, thank you. And there'll be an exclusive extra chat about today's true criminal following the main episode. In this episode's Patreon extra, find out what connects Eric Cantona and Boris Johnson's wife to today's story. He was a London taxi driver who preyed on his female passengers, a man now considered one of Britain's most prolific sex offenders. John Worboys terrorised the capital for years, attacking women who trusted him to get them home safely. In 2009, Worboys was convicted for sexual assaults against 12 women, but police admitted there were many more victims, perhaps more than 100 in total. In this episode, we'll explore how the man dubbed the Black Cab Rapist carried out his crimes, how he was finally brought to justice, and the public outcry at shocking failings by the police and other institutions along the way. Martin, you reported on this case extensively for Sky News. What are your lasting memories of the John Worboys story?
Well, there was no early warning about a taxi driver who was attacking passengers. The first any of us heard about it was early 2008 when police announced they'd arrested a London black cab driver for a string of sex attacks. Now, as a crime correspondent, I'd already reported on many horrible rape stories, but I do remember that this one felt very different. It kept growing bigger and more disturbing as we learnt more about what this guy had been up to. What started as a few complaints soon snowballed, and once Worboys' arrest hit the news, more and more women began coming forward, telling eerily similar stories, and there was quite a marked pattern of behaviour by Worboys. It became clear that we were dealing with a serial predator on an unprecedented scale. And eventually, police said there were something like over 100 women who'd probably been attacked by this one taxi driver. And I remember interviewing one woman who told a story that was typical of the women's experience, although she wasn't raped. But she'd come out of a West End club one night. She'd had a few drinks, she said, and she needed to get back to Essex. The only option really was a cab, and Worboys picked her up, told her that he'd had a good day at the races and offered her champagne, vodka or whiskey, whatever she wanted to drink. In the end, she said she had a can of Diet Coke, but even that she felt had been laced with something, and she suddenly felt very disorientated, very vulnerable. On this long journey back to Essex, he made an excuse to stop for the loo, and when he did, he got into the back of the cab with her. And she said that somebody was looking down on her because she had the strength to say, "This isn't right, just take me home." And that's what happened. And she had no memory of being attacked, and she doesn't think she was attacked. But that pattern of behaviour was exactly the sort of thing that he was doing with all his victims.
Sounds like she had a really lucky escape. I remember the story really clearly, Martin, because as a woman, there's an unspoken sense of trust when you get into a cab. You're getting into a cab, often with a male driver. You're just in that small space alone. But he exploited that trust in such a calculated way with methods like you've just described with the alcohol.
Yeah, women who got into his black cab thought they were in safe hands. The black cab has long been a symbol of safety, particularly for young women alone late out at night. It was a safe way of getting home. You had no worries. But instead, he turned that feeling of safety against them. His ruse was that he'd claim he was celebrating a big lottery win or a casino windfall, or, like I said, talking to that victim, a win on the horses. He'd even show his passengers a bag stuffed with cash so that they believed what he was saying. Then out would come the champagne, a friendly offer of a drink to share the celebration, and sometimes, like that woman I interviewed, he'd stop the cab and get into the back with them. But the champagne he gave them was laced with strong sedatives, like temazepam. His victims would black out, remembering little to nothing, and wake up to discover they'd been sexually assaulted, or at least suspect that in some way they'd been attacked. Some just really didn't know whether they had been assaulted or not. It was a devious plan, a charming middle-aged cab driver with a convincing story, free drinks, but ultimately a nightmare for his victims. And as more details emerged, his past as a stripper, even a porn actor in his earlier years, it painted a picture of a manipulative, predatory man hiding in plain sight. For me as a reporter, it was one of those cases that just kept getting more shocking with each revelation. John Worboys' life revolved around sex.
We're all much wiser with the benefit of hindsight, but even researching and reminding myself of this story for True Criminals today made me really question, Martin, would I have been taken in by that? If somebody like him, very charming, had told me he'd had a big win at the races or something to celebrate, would I have accepted a small mouthful of champagne? And I don't really know the answer to that. Now, I obviously wouldn't, but you can see why people got taken in, I think, can't you?
He was very plausible.
Eventually, it did all lead to a trial, and you were also involved in that. You covered that, didn't you?
I did. In March 2009, I was at Croydon Crown Court each day, reporting for Sky News on the proceedings. I don't go to Croydon Crown Court very often, but when I do, it's often a very memorable trial. I think the one before or after, I can't remember the timing, was Eric Cantona, the footballer, who very famously appeared at Croydon Crown Court. The testimonies from Worboys' victims, well, they were harrowing. Many of the victims were young, in their late teens or 20s, and they described how a late-night cab ride home turned into a drugged assault. Some of them broke down in tears, recalling fragmented memories of Worboys attacking them. Some didn't even remember being attacked, but woke up convinced that they had been. It was powerful and upsetting testimony, but these brave women helped ensure Worboys was found guilty. I remember distinctly the senior investigating officer coming out after the verdicts, standing outside the doors of Croydon Crown Court and heaping praise on the bravery of the women who'd given evidence. This dangerous man was finally off the streets, at least for a while.
Let's go back to the beginning of the story and look at how John Worboys went undetected for so long and what finally and thankfully led to his arrest.
The first reports police got of women being attacked in black cabs dated back to 2002, when women were telling the Metropolitan Police that something had happened to them in a taxi. They'd blacked out or been assaulted. Over the next 6 years, more women came forward with similar accounts, and by 2007, at least 14 women had reported alarming experiences in London cabs that, in hindsight, I suppose, we now know were Worboys attacks. But police failed to see the pattern at that time, and Each case was very sadly looked at on its own.
So basically complaints were being made for years, but nobody realised that a single predator was behind all of these similar incidents.
That's the case. It wasn't until 2007 that police came close to stopping Worboys. In October that year, a 19-year-old university student reported a terrifying encounter. She'd been picked up by a cabbie who'd offered her a drink. She later woke up with unexplained bruises and without her underwear. Must have been terribly alarming for her. She went straight to the police and they followed it up and arrested Worboys. But Worboys smooth-talked his way out of trouble. He told officers that the woman was drunk and that she'd been the one making advances on him, even kissing him when she left the cab. Incredibly, the police believed his version of events. They found CCTV footage showing the woman unsteady on her feet, which they misinterpreted as evidence that she was intoxicated and not a victim. Worboys was released without charge. Police didn't search his taxi or his home even. If they had, they might have found the stash of champagne, drugs and other evidence he carried, which ultimately they did, but not on this occasion. Because of that mistake, Worboys was free to continue attacking women. And I suppose this was clear evidence of sexist, even misogynistic culture in the Met that we've heard so much about since then.
And what was it about that particular attack on the 19-year-old that led them to Worboys?
I think they must quite clearly have identified the cab that she'd gone home in. Whether she remembered the number of the cab, I don't know.
It's unbelievable, though, to think that they actually had him in custody in 2007 and then let him go to attack more women.
Yeah, and after he was let go, he went back to hunting victims, as you would expect. He probably felt that he was bulletproof. In late 2007 and into early 2008, he assaulted several more women. Finally, in February 2008, the police caught up with him again. Another victim came forward. Her case, along with a couple of others around that time, finally made the police realise that they had a serial offender at large. And on the 16th of February that year, John Worboys was arrested again, and this time the evidence was stronger. A few days later, he was charged with multiple offences. Initially 1 rape, 4 sex assaults, and 6 counts of administering a substance with intent to sexually assault. These charges related to attacks on 5 different women. That was already a lot, but it turned out it was just the tip of the iceberg.
And when detectives arrested Worboys in 2008, did they finally search his black cab and his house for, well, the tricks of his trade, if you like, the stash of champagne or whatever he was giving to his victims?
They did, and they did exactly what they should have done on the previous occasion when they arrested him. They found some damning evidence: bottles of champagne spiked with high doses of sedatives, plastic cups and other telltale items he used in his attacks. There were condoms, money that he'd show his victims, pretending it was money that he'd won on the races. There were cigarettes, lots of cigarettes that he used to offer his victims. He basically had a rape kit in his taxi, all the tools for his crimes. They even found notebooks where Worboys had scrawled out possible excuses and alibis, as though he was planning how to talk his way out if questioned, which is what he did on that first occasion. It was a treasure trove of evidence, and it linked him directly to the assaults, so he couldn't escape this time.
It all sounds so cold and calculating when you hear details like that. He'd obviously put a lot of thought into his crimes, but once Worboys' arrest was made public, the story really then blew up, didn't it? It
did. The Met Police took the unusual step of making a public appeal because they suspected there were more victims out there. They released Worboys' photo and asked any other women who might have been attacked to come forward and talk to them. And the response was overwhelming. By the time Worboys went to trial in 2009, police had received reports from 83 separate women with similar accusations, 83 potential victims. Now, it's a common thing, isn't it, that individually women rape victims often are unwilling to report an attack. They think they won't be believed. They think sometimes that they might even be blamed. And historically, that really was the way some rape victims were treated by police. But once they knew that there were many others who told similar stories, they realised that they weren't on their own, that they would be believed, and they were emboldened to come forward. And that's what happened. Ultimately, the CPS focused on a smaller number of cases that they felt they could prove beyond doubt. They proceeded with charges related to 14 victims at trial, and Worboys was found guilty on 19 charges in total. Those included rape, sex assault and drugging, committed against 12 of the women who gave evidence.
And what was he sentenced to, Martin?
In April 2009, John Worboys was sentenced to what was called an imprisonment for public protection, IPP, a type of sentence that's since been scrapped because it's been so problematic. Under IPP, Worboys was effectively given an open-ended sentence with a minimum term of 8 years. So 8 years was the minimum he'd have to serve, but in theory, he could be kept in prison longer if he was still seen to be a threat. Now, I remember outside the court there was a sense of vindication among the victims who'd come forward. They saw Worboys led away in handcuffs to begin what everybody assumed would be a very long stretch in prison.
I've never heard of a sentence like that, an imprisonment for public protection. And it seems odd to me. Minimum of 8 years doesn't sound an awful lot. Was that part of the reason this particular IPP was scrapped? Did it have some anomalies in it?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, but strictly speaking, for one rape you can get a life sentence. But the IPP was scrapped pretty soon after because people thought it didn't work. And although it's no longer issued, there are still people in the system who were sentenced under IPP, but for various reasons are still inside, and it caused a great deal of controversy.
Our podcast, True Criminals, is a year old. Thank you to all those on Patreon and to our listeners who followed us over the year and heard stories that have ranged from serial killers like Fred West and Myra Hindley to mysteries like the disappearance of Madeleine McCann and Lord Lucan, to robbers including Playboy thief Valerio Vice and great train mastermind Bruce Reynolds. As a Christmas end-of-year special this year, we want to devote an episode to answering your questions about stories we've covered in previous episodes. Ask us anything you want, and Martin and I will do our best to answer. Tell us who you are, what you like about the show, and of course, ask your question by email, or even better, send a voice recording to contact@audiobleachglobal.com. That's contact@audiobleachglobal.com. Martin, you were there in court. What was Worboys like, and did he ever show any remorse at all?
Certainly didn't show any remorse. Well, he said he didn't do it. He said the women were mistaken or they were making it up. And he appeared, as you might imagine, I think, he was arrogant and dismissive of what was being said against him. But of course, the evidence was overwhelming, and in the end, he was convicted of all the charges and probably felt quite surprised that he hadn't won the day.
With Worboys' conviction and sentencing, I suppose people thought the case was closed, but the story was actually far from over. The public and the press started asking hard questions about how this man, a serial rapist, had managed to get away with his crimes and go undetected for so long.
The public reaction was one of anger and disbelief. First, there was outrage that Worboys hadn't been caught much sooner when there were opportunities to do that. After the trial, it emerged just how many opportunities had been missed. In 2010, a formal independent investigation by the Independent Police Complaints Commission concluded that the Metropolitan Police officers had made serious mistakes and had failed to take victims seriously. For instance, the 19-year-old student from 2007, she later told The Guardian that when she reported her assault, Police officers actually laughed at her injuries. Can you imagine that? She had bruises and even evidence her drink was tampered with. But she says, quote, "The police said I must have been drunk and fallen over. I was not believed. It was as if I was the criminal." Now that's horrifying to read, isn't it? Not only did these women endure awful attacks, but when they tried to get help from the police, they were patronised or ignored. Again, evidence of sexism or misogyny in police ranks.
There's no wonder, really, when you hear stories like that so few women do come forward because they're worried they won't be believed or it'll be thought that they egged somebody on in some way. This was so unusual because of the public appeal. And I suppose a lot of those 83 women who came forward perhaps thought that their attack was in isolation. So it's such an unusual story and a damning indictment of the police. And the sentence that he got in 2009, the 8 years minimum, how did that go down?
Badly. That became another source of anger. Worboys' sentence was criticised as too lenient, given the scale of his crimes. Rape can carry a life sentence, and here was a man who'd assaulted dozens of women, yet theoretically, under the IPP scheme, he could walk free after just 8 years. Women's rights groups were furious. You can understand that. There were calls for the Attorney General to review the sentence as unduly lenient. But in the end, no review happened. A government rape advisor at the time even said it had not gone down well and appeared on the low side for such egregious, serious offending. There was public dismay that he might get out early.
And that fear turned out to be justified.
It did. In January 2018, almost a decade after the conviction, we learnt that the parole board had decided John Worboys was fit to be released. That news landed like a bombshell. It came out that a parole board panel, meeting behind closed doors, had assessed Worboys and approved him for release on licence after he'd served about 9 years. It's hard to overstate the outrage that followed that. The media, politicians and especially the victims were in uproar. How could a man who'd been dubbed Britain's most prolific rapist be freed after such a short sentence?
And the way all of that was handled made it even worse, right?
Yeah, it did. The victims weren't even told that Worboys was going to be released. Many of these women found out from the news or social media. The chairman of the parole board at the time, Nick Hardwick, had to apologise unreservedly when it emerged that some victims only learned about Worboys' impending freedom through the media. I spoke to one victim that week and she told me she was devastated by the news. She said that all the victims had been assured back in 2009 when he was jailed that Worboys would never be released. They'd signed up to be notified of any change, yet here they were, hearing it not from the authorities, but from reporters like me. She was shaken, extremely upset. It was like reliving the trauma, she said, seeing his face on TV and knowing that he might be free again. The system had failed these women yet again by keeping them in the dark.
I remember the public outcry, and also a lot of MPs got involved, demanding answers too.
It became a national controversy. Senior members of Parliament, like Yvette Cooper, who then chaired the Home Affairs Committee, publicly demanded to know how on earth the parole board reached this decision and called for transparency. Now, at that time, parole hearings were shrouded in secrecy by law, so nobody could see the rationale for freeing Worboys. People were asking, has he confessed? Has he shown any remorse? Or could he be manipulating the system? One victim's lawyer, Richard Scorer, voiced what many felt. He called Worboys an exceptionally manipulative and dangerous individual who should never be allowed back into society. There was a real fear that if released, Worboys might harm more women.
So what happened next?
Well, it led to an extraordinary legal challenge. Two of Worboys' victims, who didn't want to be named publicly, so were known in court as DSD and NBV, just by initials, launched a judicial review to stop his release. Now think about it. These women, who'd already been through hell, had to go back to court to keep the man who raped them in prison. It was unprecedented in many ways. In March 2018, the High Court actually overturned the Parole Board's decision to release Worboys, citing that the board had not done enough to investigate whether he was truly safe to be free. It was a huge victory for the victims. The Parole Board's chairman, Nick Hardwick, then resigned under pressure, essentially taking responsibility for the fiasco, and the Justice Secretary at the time ordered an urgent review of the parole system.
Fiasco, I think, is such a good word to use. It seems that all common sense had gone out of the window when you look at his history and how many women came forward and how many counts he was convicted on. So the parole decision was quashed and Worboys stayed behind bars. What about the police failures? I gather that around the same time there was also a landmark ruling about those police failures.
Yes, the same year, 2018, another big development. The two victims I mentioned, known by those initials DSD and NBV, had also sued the Met Police for failing to investigate Worboys properly. That case went all the way to the UK Supreme Court. In February that year, the Supreme Court ruled in the victims' favour, declaring that the Met Police's serious failures in the Worboys case breached the women's human rights. It set a powerful precedent again. For the first time, victims could hold the police accountable under human rights law for not adequately investigating violent crimes. The court acknowledged that if the police had done their job when those early reports about Worboys came in, many later victims, potentially over 100, would have been spared. The woman known as DSD delivered a memorable message after that ruling. She said to the police, "You have the procedures in place. Now start doing your job. Had you done your job properly, there would not have been 105 victims." Now that really points up the institutional failure here. A lack of belief in the victims from the start enabled a predator to keep offending.
It's actually quite difficult to hear that, and good honour for having the courage to push forward with that, because I'm sure it wouldn't have been easy. The police, the courts, the parole system, every step of the way there were failures that either enabled Worboys or threatened to enable him to attack again.
Yes, in the end he wasn't released in 2018 thanks to those legal challenges. After the High Court blocked Worboys' release, the authorities went back to work on the case. Remember, during the 2009 trial, the prosecution had only used a fraction of the allegations against Worboys. With him still in custody and the public feeling firmly against him ever getting out, police reinvestigated some of those other cases that hadn't been tried yet. And given all the media attention, a number of additional victims, including some who'd stayed silent before, came forward with new evidence. This led to Worboys being charged for historical attacks that had not been part of the first trial.
So did that mean, Martin, that he faced a second trial?
It did. In 2019, John Worboys, who by then had actually changed his name to John Radford in prison, was hauled back into court to answer for some of those other crimes. He ultimately admitted to attacking 4 more women with offences dating back to 2000. Those early victims finally got their day in court too, and I was there for that second sentencing. In December 2019, Worboys was given 2 more life sentences for those extra crimes. The judge set a new minimum term of 6 years on those life sentences. That meant that Worboys would not even be considered for release again until at least 2025. Essentially, the public outcry and the victims coming forward ensured that this man stayed in prison. The woman who led the charge to keep him locked up, known as DSD, said after the 2009 sentencing, "I fear for other women if he is ever released." That really sums it up, doesn't it? Even with all this, the victims still worry about the day he might get out.
I know, and yet again it comes back to me thinking that minimum term of 6 years on those life sentences just doesn't really sound very much. When you think about it, Martin, how those women's lives were changed forever, because it isn't just the assault. These are issues that they'll probably live with for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. He did about 10 years before the issue of his release came up that caused all the controversy. So he stayed in prison. He got another minimum of 6 years. So that effectively, eventually, because of the pressure that was exerted, became a minimum sentence of 16 on a life sentence, which I think, if that's what he'd been given at the end of the first trial, would have been much more acceptable to people. So he is due, I think, a parole hearing about now or sometime this year. I've heard nothing about it. We talk to the parole board from time to time to see what cases are coming up. I'm not aware that there's anything in the system in which Worboys has applied for parole so far, but I think given what was said at his last trial, he should be due at least the chance to ask for a parole hearing sometime soon.
Yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on that. He was such a prolific attacker, and I can imagine if he is released in the coming months or years, there'll be a lot of women that feel probably very uncomfortable about that. I think it's a relief to know that at the minute he's still behind bars. And this case did bring about some important changes, didn't it?
It did. There were quite a few. Several major reforms in policing, victims' rights and the parole system. So first, on the policing side, the Met Police had to confront their failures, not for the first time. After the Supreme Court ruling in particular, there was a renewed focus on believing victims of sexual assault and thoroughly investigating their claims. It was a wake-up call that shoddy police work and dismissive attitudes have real consequences. In this case, dozens of women were attacked who needn't have been. The Met eventually apologised and paid compensation to those 2 women who sued them. Police forces across the country reviewed how they handled sexual offence allegations, such as ensuring patterns of predatory behaviour were spotted sooner. It really is sad that it took so many victims, but policing practices did start to change because of Worboys.
And what about the parole system? Did that start to change because of Worboys too?
It did. This was quite a big change. It opened up the parole board system and certainly made reporting parole decisions much easier for reporters like me. The Worboys case led to a wholesale reform of the parole board process. The government realised the public had lost confidence in how decisions were being made in secret. So in 2018, the rules were changed. They allowed much more transparency and accountability in parole board decisions. They lifted the blanket ban on revealing parole reasoning. Now, summaries of why someone like Worboys is or isn't being released can be provided to victims and even made public. Also, victims of crime were given new rights to challenge parole decisions without having to go to full judicial review in the High Court. In fact, the Justice Secretary announced a new reconsideration mechanism, essentially a way for a decision to be looked at again, especially in high-profile cases, if there were concerns. The victim contact scheme was also overhauled and expanded to ensure that no victim is left in the dark like Worboys victims were.
So hopefully it means victims' voices are now harder to ignore.
Yes, the case helped make victims' rights a consideration in the release process. Harriet Wistrich, a well-known lawyer who represented many of the women, pointed out that it wasn't a lack of resources that failed these victims, but a lack of belief amongst police officers. A cultural change was needed, and that message did get through. So, training for police dealing with sexual violence cases was improved in the aftermath. There's also been talk of improved vetting and checks for taxi drivers. Organisations like the Susie Lamplugh Trust pointed out that Worboys' case showed serious flaws in how drivers' backgrounds were checked and monitored. His taxi licence wasn't revoked, even after women reported him.
That's incredible to think it wasn't revoked. The whole thing, Martin, feels bittersweet, a lot of suffering for the women he attacked, which I'm sure continues. But by speaking out and having the courage and strength to fight back, they really have helped bring about some incredible reforms.
It's changed so many things. Horrific as it is, this case has had a lasting impact on the criminal justice system. The police have had to change how they handle sexual violence cases. The parole board is far more transparent and accountable than it was before. It exposed how victims can be failed at every turn, but it also showed the power of victims to force change. The fact that Worboys was eventually kept in prison and prosecuted for more crimes is largely thanks to the determination of those women who refused to be silenced.
Well, John Worboys is in his late 60s now and does remain behind bars for now. Given his history, there's perhaps a strong chance he may never be freed, which I'm sure would be a relief to all those he hurt. One lawyer for the victims said they would only be satisfied if life really means life in this case, and I think that sentiment is probably widely shared.
Yes, one victim told the Independent newspaper she still fears what he might do if he's ever out, calling Worboys exceptionally manipulative and dangerous. That says it all, I suppose. Some individuals are so dangerous, it's widely believed, that society has to be protected from them permanently.
You always take a little nugget of wisdom, I think, away from all of the big cases that you've been involved in. What did you take away from this case, Martin?
I think it's the obvious thing, because I'm somebody who uses black cabs an awful lot, although I'm not a woman, obviously. But the idea that the black cab was a symbol of safety was embedded in our minds for donkey's years. Even as a young student, I always thought getting in a black cab when I could afford one was a passport to safety if I was having to get home late at night. And the threat of violence on the streets of London was quite real in those days, my student days of 1970s, but even more so for women. And I think women, friends, relatives, when I've known that they've been travelling home late at night in a black cab, I've always felt, well, you are 100% safe. And of course, what this case, the Worboys case, did was to turn all that upside down. Has it had a lasting effect? I think there probably were women who, after the Worboys case, hesitated before getting in a black cab. I don't know that it's had that kind of lasting effect. Hopefully it hasn't, and I don't know of any other cases of black cab rapists. So I think women today probably do feel safe to get into a black cab. I suppose the other thing that strikes me is those missed opportunities that police had, and it just goes so back to that idea that for a long time police had this reputation for being sexist and misogynist. Certainly in those days it was much more rife, and of course there are examples of it today, and it was only 2-3 years ago that Louise Casey's report into the Metropolitan Police found it still institutionally sexist and misogynistic and racist, of course. But I think in a police force the size of the Met, and maybe some of the other smaller forces, there will always be an element of officers who have that kind of attitude, and it's up to people like Mark Rowley, the commissioner at the Met, and his fellow chief officers to do everything they can to root them out.
And hats off as well to the women, hats off to all those victims who were strong enough to come forward after being attacked. And they can feel satisfied that as well as that, they brought about lasting change, both for the parole board and for the police.
Lots of changes in the criminal justice system, largely down to those brave women.
Well, thanks, Martin, for all your insights and memories there. And I think I'll probably speak for both of us to say that our respect and admiration does go out to those women who did find the strength to come forward and keep fighting. They're the true heroes who brought this dangerous predator, known as the Black Cab Rapist, to justice. Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Martin and I haven't even got one of those yet. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.